We're somewhere different today. We're at the hottest gardens in the UK, Ventnor Botanic Gardens on the Isle of Wight, where we've been asked to come for a week to work to help with their autumn tidy up.
One of the things we love about Ventnor Botanic Gardens is their style of gardening, the Ventnor Method. It's very similar to permaculture, and we'll be sharing more about this later when we meet Chris Kidd, the curator here. Ventnor Botanic Garden lies at the heart of a remarkable microclimate on the south coast of the Isle of Wight. Often up to 5 degrees warmer than the average UK temperature, Ventnor Botanic Gardens really is Britain's hottest garden. Conceived back in 1972, the 22-acre garden has over 6,000 species of rare and subtropical plants thriving outdoors. Unprotected from the elements, a feat few other gardens in the UK can replicate on such a scale. Plants native to the furthest corners of the earth can be found here, from the fertile valleys of New Zealand to the South American Andes. What makes the garden so unique is its innovative way it's curated. Plants are left to naturalise and make their own mini ecosystems as they would in the natural world.
Let's go and meet Chris Kidd, the curator, to find out more about the Ventnor Method.
Here at the garden we employ a style of planting within our geographical areas called the Ventnor Method. And this is something that we've developed over the last 20 years where we're trying to show plants growing together with each other in the way that they would be in the wild. So you're showing a community of plants. It's a sort of synthetic ecosystem where we're putting the plants in and as closely mimicking the wild as we can in areas from the old world Mediterranean, Australia, South Africa and New Zealand. And in doing so we produce a tapestry of plants which makes you feel like you're actually in the area itself. And this is a combination of utilising the climate here of the Undercliff at Ventnor, which is 5 degrees warmer than the rest of the UK, with the genetic information which is stored within the plants that come from the regions of the world that share this climate. When you put the two together, it works magic. So if you imagine the wild, there are no gardeners. You have plants that are genetically programmed to work in that area and fulfill their lives, sow themselves, flower, regenerate and occupy a space in a community of other plants with associated fungi and other organisms living in a balance together. And so when we do the same thing here, we're mimicking the wild, suddenly we don't need gardeners. In the wild there are no gardeners, and yet there are these magnificent landscapes which are a treasure to see. And using that style here, we find the same thing. So the role over the last 20 years of gardeners here has become diminished, and we're into a position where our gardeners are actually population managers. We tried to mimic the wild where plants don't follow the rule book, so we would dig a hole and put 3 or 4 species in, and that might be 10 or 11 individuals, and allow them to grow themselves and grow how they wanted to rather than how we thought they should. And we don't prune anything. We don't use pesticides or insecticides or fertilisers. We try not to use compost. We use what you would find in the wild. And so if there are leaves on the ground, they stay there because nobody sweeps the wild. If a branch dies, it stays there because nobody prunes anything in the wild. Sometimes you have to be mindful of our visitors, so they need to have clear pathways. But as much as possible everywhere else, you leave the plants to manage themselves and to grow themselves. And in doing so, you get the archetypal landscape that we were seeking all along. And for years, I think people tried to do this and they over-gardened. Throw a whole load of gardeners in and mollycoddle and do things. But when you kind of abandon that, take the rule book and forget all about it and go back to the very basic principles and look at the wild for inspiration. If you've got the right climate and the plants which are genetically programmed to live in that climate, your role is simply to put them in and watch the magic happen.
Being an island, the Isle of Wight is only accessible by ferry, and it takes around 40 minutes from Portsmouth Harbour. It's only a few miles away, but it's just enough time to sit back and take it all in.
One of the first jobs we got involved with was in the Japanese garden, nestled on the slopes surrounded by grandfather trees. It's a fairly new introduction the team is still developing. It has all manners of camellia varieties, which will be quite a spectacle in years to come. Since the planting isn't established yet, we were tasked with removing unwanted plant species in preparation for one of our favourite jobs, putting down a thick woodchip mulch. Our regular viewers will know how much we love using woodchip mulch at Freedom Forest. It has many benefits. There's a natural succession in nature, and in temperate areas like England, most land would become old-growth forest if left alone for long enough, like it once was before humans. An area cleared of its natural vegetation, with the soil exposed to full sun, is the furthest from forest and therefore the hardest to maintain. Vigorous plants, which we often call weeds, are activated by these conditions as a defence to cover the soil to prevent soil erosion. The condition of the soil will dictate what type of pioneer species colonate the area. Perennial weeds can be a better indicator to soil conditions than annuals, and weed communities are better indicators than a single species. For example, on dry, exposed soil, you may find colonies of fireweed, St. John's wort and yarrow. And on heavy or compacted soils, you may notice tap-rooted perennials like yellow dock, dandelion or plantains. The taproots alleviate compaction over time. When a plant dies, its roots compost in the ground, leaving organic matter and places for soil life to move around easier. Mulched directly onto topsoil, woodchip simulates forest conditions and provides a fungal dominant soil, perfect for shrubs and trees. If thick enough, it eliminates nearly all of the pioneer weed species, retains moisture and provides a liquid feed each time it rains.
When you first bring this style of horticulture together, in the first couple of years it's a battle zone between the plants trying to assume domination within the area that you've changed. But over a period of time, between 10 and 15 years, a balance is brought. But we find interesting things amongst the plant community. Some plants initially become dominant, but then fall by the wayside over time. Some plants we put in a particular area where we try to mimic the wild as close as we can, and they decide that that's not for them, and they'll move and they'll sow themselves into another part of the garden. Some plants will initially be planted and find a place where they want to live and remain there for a long period of time. And we found one particular group of plants that lived underneath a palm tree. A population of 3 or 4 annual plants regenerated themselves every year, stayed there for 18 years, and then suddenly moved to another part of the garden, and now they live there in harmony instead. Some plants, interestingly, are antagonistic to each other. So in the Mediterranean garden we have areas where Echium and Euphorbia won't mix. They exclude each other by some way in a form that we really don't understand. And that's the truth of this, is that there's so much about this that we really don't know, that we're discovering ourselves as we pursue this method. And we understand that there's a much wider network of life going on here. So there are insects that we've never brought in ourselves, which happen to live now amongst these communities. Fungi that haven't been recorded in the UK before, which are found in these communities in their natural part of the world, have turned up here spontaneously. So really and truthfully, what we're showing here now is not just a glimpse of the wild, but an actual expression of the wild. A way of seeing the Mediterranean in Ventnor without having to actually travel to see it.
We're here in this beautiful palm garden today where we're digging out lots of self-seeded Agapanthus and potting them on. This is an evergreen variety from South Africa. Most of the South African varieties come from the Western Cape, which has a Mediterranean-style climate with moist, damp winters. So they're much more tender than their deciduous relatives, which can withstand down to -10 to -15 degrees Celsius. They love the conditions in the garden and can be seen even growing from rocks like orchids. They are pretty tough plants and can take the stress of being dug up and divided.
We moved on later to the terraces overlooking the restaurant to remove some unwanted bramble. Keeping the paths open for visitors is a continual job and accounts for most of the pruning done around the gardens. This is done in keeping with the Ventnor Method, of course. Maintenance and pruning is done as invisibly as possible, with the aim of leaving the areas left looking like they haven't been disturbed at all. We loved walking the dogs at sunrise each morning on some of the stunning beaches the island holds.
One of the plants that we're very well known for at the Botanic Garden of Ventnor is the Echium. People ask us in May when they're in flower, what's the giant triffid or the huge lupin? And it's these magnificent plants which come from the Canary Isles, which flower once in their life and produce hundreds of thousands of flowers and hundreds of thousands of seeds, and have been naturalised here at Ventnor for the last 20 years, perhaps even more. And when we grow these together with other species from the Atlantic Isles, they hybridise very readily because they don't know each other in the wild. And yet when they're brought close together in cultivation, they take the opportunity to share genetic information and produce amazing, very interesting hybrids as a result. Some Echiums have one species which is endemic to a single island and lives only on that island, and sometimes only to a particular volcanic caldera. So when we bring together species of Echium from these Atlantic islands that have never met themselves in the wild, when they come close in cultivation, they take the opportunity to blend their genes by hybridising, and we have a cross here between two. So we have an Echium that comes from Tenerife and another Echium from a nearby island, which wouldn't know each other in the wild at all. Bring them together in cultivation and they cross, and they produce this hybrid, which is a mix between the two. It's a very tall hybrid from one parent, but branched from the other. And the genes within are a real mix. It produces a very vigorous plant that has hybrid vigour. But the seed from this will start to segregate out and have some of the mixture within. And so in the wild you would find that this is the way that species happen, that over a long period of time, many hundreds if not thousands of generations, a new stability will be found with the mixed genetic information which is inside and create a new species.
This is Signal Point. It's a restored Victorian cottage nestled amongst the plants and trees at the gardens, with views across the English Channel. It was a dream job of mine to be tasked with rediscovering its own private palm garden, which had become lost to nature. I was in my complete element, surrounded by my favourite hardy palms, dreaming of when parts of Freedom Forest look like this one day. We also did some work in the medicinal garden. It wasn't an uncommon sight to see one of the kitchen staff out here collecting culinary herbs. from barebacks, now to the outback with Chris.
Another group of plants that we've found very successful here at Ventnor Botanic Garden, growing in our Ventnor Method style, is Eucalyptus in the Australian section. So when you look through there, you're there. This is the whole thing with the Ventnor Method, is the expression of success can be found in that the plants grow and reproduce and sow themselves and grow where they want to grow rather than where we grow them. But you also have this immersion. So when you're in amongst it, you actually feel like you're there. And nothing that you can see here in front of me is from anywhere else in the world apart from New South Wales. So this is as close to being there as you could possibly get. In the genesis of this area, this was a very difficult area to work with, and we had about 5 acres of mud here where we'd removed the invasive evergreen oak species which had been here for over a century with completely guilt-free conscience because there was nothing better here. Removed those and then wanted to plant in this landscape with eucalyptus and native Australian plants. But it's a very tough area to work with. We had the very steep banks. And so to ameliorate this, we got in a company called Eccleston George, who made artificial rocks, and these are all artificial rocks. The concept being that they're ultimate recyclers. They make the rock over a waste material. So down here we have a pile of pallets, and there's a washing machine. And they said the only limitation to the size of the rock that could be built was the size of the rubbish that was underneath. And so I said, well, why don't we get a couple of buses, and then we can make massive bus-sized rocks. And they thought it was a great idea, so that's exactly what we did. I went to a local scrapyard and found 2 buses, which they let us have for nothing, and we brought them over onto site and craned them in. And the first thing that the locals and the people of the area knew was within this 5 acres of mud we had 2 ruined buses up on a hillside. And we went through a long process of getting them to understand what we were doing. The concept was that on the south side, closest to where you walk, we would make huge sheer faces and incorporate Aboriginal artwork so as it would be glimpsed through the trunks of the eucalyptus trees, and you would be able to see the artwork through just as if you were in Australia itself. But the locals and the councillors in particular weren't too keen on this, and they insisted we needed planning permission, which they refused, and insisted that we made the rocks much, much shorter. And so they're half the size that they should have been. And the colour which we wanted, which was a vibrant red, was forbidden too. So we ended up with, having to mimic the natural Ventnor rock, which is grey. But eventually, once they retired, we were able to put in a much smaller rock with some Aboriginal artwork and put the original vision through on the front face of this rock here, so as you could see this through the trees. And it shows really that man is part of the landscape of New South Wales and for the whole of Australia. Before the arrival of the Europeans, Homo sapiens had been there for 100,000 years perhaps, having walked there, but were living sustainably within that landscape as hunter-gatherers. They had no metals. They had a society which we really don't understand anymore because they aren't there to tell us anymore, but they lived within that ecosystem as part of the ecosystem in a sustainable way. On the right is an image of a family group, and it's argued that this, the original, would be the oldest expression of human art on the planet. It's aged to perhaps 8,000 years ago by carbon dating the lichen that grows over the top of the original pigments. Now, the people that did that had a particular culture as hunter-gatherers within this landscape, and the artwork is very accessible. You can see that it's a family group. You can see a man and a woman. You can see children carrying pots on their heads, wearing perhaps ornamental clothes, and it's quite accessible. We can see what it is. We have some familiarity and some understanding of what's going on. Now, at some point after when that was painted in Kimberley, a natural climate change event happened which affected that part of Australia, and it suggested that it became much more arid and it wasn't able to sustain this hunter-gatherer community. So they did what hunter-gatherers do, and they moved away to where they could continue their lifestyle in the environment somewhere else. And so you have this period of time where people weren't there and the artwork stopped. But about 2,000 years later, the climate became able to sustain people again, and they migrated back in. And in doing so, you start to see something dramatic had happened to the culture in this period of time. So the artwork on the left is 2,000 years younger, and it's not anywhere near as accessible. It's a picture of what we think would be an expression of a deity. We can see that there's some kind of human form in there, but it's markedly different. It's much more abstract. It's something different. So during this period of time, something very profound happened to this community of people who lived the same existence, but because of a natural climate change event, something happened when they came back, they were different. And so we come forward in time and we're going through a climate change event now, which we've brought about ourselves, and it's happening very, very quickly. And the changes that will happen to our people, to our species, to our societies, will be equally as dramatic. But will it be a positive thing that happens at the end? And I'm concerned that it probably isn't. On the other side of the rock, we see artwork which brings us up to the present. And you can see there's an outline of a white man. He's wearing a hat. And behind him there's a ship with square-rigged sails and people in rowing boats rowing out to see the Europeans as they arrive. And after that, there's a blank space, because after that event, there was no more true Aboriginal artwork that was made. The culture collapsed. The arrival of the Europeans brought things that were completely alien to this preserved continent. They brought in species which hadn't evolved there. They brought in farming. They brought in money. They brought in so many concepts completely alien to the environment, and the Aboriginal people couldn't adapt to it, and they went into decline. You have a kind of turning over. And so you have this strange outpost of Europe on the other side of the world, and the population of Aboriginal people collapsed. And so they can't tell us what any of these paintings really truly meant, because without writing to express stories onto the future, you're using folklore and verbal communication and storytelling to pass on from generation to generation the stories and the meaning, and all of that is lost. And one has to wonder what else was lost during the same time. The knowledge that they would have had of their environment as hunter-gatherers for generations, of what plants could be used for, the cures for ills, the plants that could have been used for foods, for euphorics, for the whole part of the culture. It's a story which has now been lost. And across the world we see similar stories throughout, where our joint and shared heritage as a species has been lost in time.
If these scenes of cleared forest were the Amazon, they would be described as an ecological nightmare. But at home, we call it good old traditional farming. There's not much traditional about it, really. Since the Green Revolution, human labour has been largely replaced by machinery, synthetic fertilisers and pesticides. Large areas of annual monocrops are grown, and deep tillage often leaves the soil bare for months at a time. The repeated compaction and ploughing damages the soil structure, leaving soil aggregates exposed and making it difficult for water to penetrate. Compacted, waterlogged soil leads to anaerobic conditions, making it harder still to grow healthy plants. This results in soil erosion and our soil health and heritage literally being washed down the drain. But with it, the toxic cocktail of synthetic fertilisers, herbicides, pesticides and fungicides. 80% of inorganic fertilisers leach out of the soil and end up in our water system. The nitrates from the fertilisers and slurry not only pollute the water but remove oxygen, killing aquatic life. I didn't have to search hard for these images, it was the first 2 fields I came across. To make things worse, glyphosate, the same active chemical in most common patio and pathway weed killers, is sprayed not only before sowing a crop to clear a field of vegetation, but what many people don't know is that glyphosate is widely used as a desiccant on wheat and many other grains. It's sprayed directly on your food to stress or kill the plant, to accelerate drying and speed the ripening of the grain immediately before harvest. In the UK, glyphosate began to be applied to wheat crops in the 1980s to control perennial weeds such as common couch, which was very effective and meant the sowing of the next crop could occur sooner. Its use increased with companion fungicides. Monsanto, the creator of Agent Orange, as well as glyphosate, has known its carcinogenic potential from long-term animal experiments since the early 1980s, but has repeatedly dismissed them. The World Health Organization classifies glyphosate as probably carcinogenic. Is this really the type of farmer we want? Or the food we want to be putting into our bodies? Fortunately, there is another way, based upon nature, where soil life is replenished and actually builds year on year. Some call it permaculture, some call it regenerative agriculture, but in truth, it's nothing new. Indigenous people the world over have been practising it for millennia. The soil is disturbed as minimally as possible and certainly not dug over or tilled annually. It's always covered, like in nature too, whether that be with a mulch or ground cover plants. You could describe annual plants as nature's scabs, sent to cover disturbed soil until a more perennial ecosystem can be supported. So an emphasis is placed upon growing more perennials, which are plants that grow back year after year, like fruiting trees, shrubs and plants, and vegetables like yacon, which has been cultivated throughout the Andes for centuries. It tastes like a sweet cross between apples and a mild celery. Mashua, another replant perennial related to nasturtiums. We enjoy them with roast dinners. And artichokes, to name a few. And using companion planting in a polyculture of species as much as possible. Roots are in the ground all year round, supporting the soil bacteria, fungi and microorganisms that are needed to support plants. I grew up believing plants just get the nutrients they need from the soil via their roots, and that fungi and bacteria were enemies. But science has now shown that without these and the whole web of soil life, plants can't even grow. In a nutshell, it works like this. When a plant germinates and begins to grow, it produces sugar from the photosynthesis process. This gets deposited into the roots. These are called exudates. These promote the growth of certain fungal species that specialise in extracting the nutrients that plant requires for growth. The fungi make enzymes to extract the nutrients from the minerals in your soil, the sand, clay and silt. Bacteria perform important functions in the soil too, including improving soil structure and soil aggregation, recycling of soil nutrients and water recycling. Earthworms and millipedes are some of the larger types of life found in and on the soil. They break up or shred things like leaves into smaller pieces that other life can better use. Then there are predators, things like predatory nematodes, protozoa and larger arthropods like centipedes. These predators eat the shredders, decomposers, and other life found in the soil. Their waste releases nutrients into the surrounding soil in a bioavailable form for your plants. So you might be wondering, how can plants be grown and still look good in the monoculture fields we saw earlier? Most of the chemical fertilisers used are NPK fertilisers, which are rich in nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Many are waste products from industrial processes, but industry realised plant roots can absorb these directly, bypassing the soil web. There's a few problems with this though. Prolonged use of chemical fertilisers, like the many tomato or lawn feeds used by home gardeners, kill soil life, resulting in compaction. They deplete the soil of its essential nutrients, promoting diseased plants which require a plethora of other treatments to keep them alive. It's like being on a life support machine for the plant. There are 42 essential nutrients, so giving just 3 results in food with less vitamin and mineral content. Soil that is tilled or disrupted regularly will be dominated mainly by bacteria, which is the perfect environment for low successional plants called weeds. As well as making life easier, you can also create a permanent home for native wildlife. The best part is, efforts are now showing it's scalable to large areas and can regenerate even the most degraded landscapes. We're doing our best to develop Freedom Forest in this way. It was previously used for animal grazing and a conventional market garden. If you haven't heard of us before, here's a quick introduction to what we do. Freedom Forest is 3 acres of land in the southeast of England, Zone 9A, where we practice a combination of no-dig, back to Eden and permaculture methods.
An acre is native woodland. We have a young food forest, growing beds, 3 polytunnels and a hardy tropical jungle. Our mission here at Freedom Forest is to grow and become as self-sufficient in our own food needs as possible.
Our long-term goal is to produce enough surplus vegetables to sell on so that we can use the income to cover the cost of some essential and a few luxury items we can't provide ourselves. I'm Dan.
And I'm Laurie. We hope you enjoy following our journey and learning with us here at Freedom Forest. This herbaceous border is one of my favourite places in the garden at this time of year. It's still bursting with colour and many beautiful salvias in mid-October. Salvia Phyllis Fancy is one of my favourites here. This evergreen, hardy perennial is a later flowering variety with beautiful 2-tone flowers that keep going right until the first frosts.
This is in our arid garden, and these plants here in the main are agaves, which come from North America, Mexico in particular. These plants, when they were first brought into the UK, caused a sensation when they came into flower in the Victorian era. We moved forward through time, and with climate change, we now have so many more agaves that we can grow out of doors because of the warmer climate that we have thanks to human agency. And so on this bank we have over a dozen species of agave, and these are flowering here for the first time. So the large spikes that you can see are of Agave proto-americana. And these are the first flowerings outdoors of these agaves that have ever been recorded. You can also see some spikes of other agave, Agave salmiana, which is a winter flowering agave. They start producing these giant spikes of asparagus at this time of year, which will go dormant during the winter when it's very cold, and then finish their flowering in the spring. This is our new palm garden. We have the National Collection of Palms at Ventnor, and the reason the palms are here is rooted in history. Over 100 years ago, Robert Fortune travelled to China to collect palm seed for wealthy individuals back in the UK during the burgeoning garden age within Britain. And he sent seed back and they were germinated. And the expectation within the UK is that these would have been subtropical plants that needed bright sunshine and high temperatures. And so when they were grown, they were put into greenhouses and large estates with glass houses. And so we have a time there in the 1870s where in the UK you could have grown one species of palm outside, the Trachycarpus fortunei. Moving forward through time, we're really seeing the expression of the thousands of tons of carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere from the Industrial Revolution and the climate change which is happening globally being magnified and shown here very clearly at Ventnor. And so at the start of the 21st century, the climate has now moved on to not just being able to have one species of palm, but 24. And so we created a palm garden for the 21st century at Ventnor to show the palms that could be grown now. So in the avenue, we have an avenue of Washingtonia palms, the giant cloud dusters that you would normally see in North America in the wild. They're the ones that grow in Beverly Hills along the boulevards. And in between, we've planted Jubea, which is a giant palm with enormous trunks, which comes from Chile. At the very end of this particular avenue, we have a rather poignant plant. It's a seedling of the giant Jubea that was grown in the temperate house at Kew, and at one time it was the largest indoor plant in cultivation, which has now had to be cut down. And so this is a survivor as a seedling of a plant which once had to be grown under glass but is now thriving and is the focus of our main palm avenue here at the Botanic Garden out of doors. And this is a close relative of a palm that used to grow on Easter Island, which is an example of, you know, there's a lesson to be learned for the whole of humanity on Easter Island of the complete ecological and hence onwards sociological collapse of society there. The Polynesians arrived at Easter Island in a comparatively short amount of time. They arrived perhaps 20,000 years ago. Found a very rich volcanic island with a very strong endemic flora like islands all over the globe. And they overexploited their environment. They cut down all the trees, including the relative of this palm, which was a truly giant Jubea, denuded the landscape and turned it into instead of an island idyll, a heaven, they turned it into a hell which couldn't support the population. And if you take that example and move it to the macro, it's the same thing that we're doing to the whole planet now, is that we're overusing our resources. And unless we have dramatic and huge change in a very short period of time, we'll find ourselves to be exactly the same as the Easter Islanders were.
One of Chef Brad's specialities is plant-based dishes, which were to die for. There's nothing like a cold beer made from hops and eucalyptus that was grown in the garden itself.
Wow, what an amazing week we've had. We're now back home here at Freedom Forest in our own eucalyptus forest, and we really hope you've enjoyed watching this video.
We'd love to hear from you in the comments below about any of the topics that we've covered in this video today, and also what you think about the gardens too.
It really helps us out if you can like the video by pressing the button below, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and press the notification bell button, and that will inform you every time we put out new content.
Thanks for watching today.
Peace
and
and plants.